and it is great to be with you, whether you are watching us online or whether you are here in the building. And we are midway through November, and as we heard from those very exciting notices, that can mean only one thing, that Christmas is a month away. Bring it on. And Christmas means presents. And this morning, we are looking at the topic of Sabbath. David just read to us from Exodus 20. On 6 days, you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And the Sabbath, or Shabbat, is a practice which means to stop, to cease from all of your work, or in plain English, to take a day off. And Sabbath is a present. Sabbath is the good gift of God's rest. And I want to talk this morning about 3 aspects of that gift, of that present. Firstly, the gift of rest. Secondly, the gift of joy. And finally, the gift to be shared. So firstly, the gift of rest. And if this was Christmas and there was a beautifully wrapped present with a silken bow with your name on it under the tree, the very last thing that you would do would be to not open it. But of all the 10 commandments which we have been looking at over the last few weeks, I think that the Sabbath is the one that we take the least seriously. It is the one actually that we take for granted. And I want to take us back to Mount Sinai, which is where the Israelites had gathered in the desert, waiting for Moses to come down this mountain with these stone tablets on which were written these 10 words from God. And I think when Moses read out about the Sabbath, it must have been an absolute shock to them. These guys were not 9 to 5, Monday to Friday people. They weren't Saturday brunch people, and they certainly weren't Sunday lunch people. They didn't have half-term plans, and they had never been skiing. They were slaves. Slaves, right? Right at the beginning of Exodus 1, when we first learn about Moses in the story, actually before we even learn about Moses, we learn about the Israelites, and we learn about the Egyptians, that the Egyptians have oppressed the Israelites, that they put slave masters over them, that the Israelites have to work in brick and mortar. They build cities for the Egyptians. And it says that they had bitter lives with hard labor. The Egyptians used them ruthlessly, quote unquote. And God, he takes them out of all of that, and he says, I want you to stop and have a day off. And you might think that's like the best news in the world. But if you had been brought up to work for your survival, to craft bricks out of mud and straw all day and every day, to hear that you could have had a day off must have been absolutely unbelievable. And I think it might also have been a little bit scary, because it would take faith to stop working and to choose to rely on God, because their whole lives, their means of survival was work. And for us in London, the truth is that I don't think most people here are 9 to 5 people, and Monday to Friday probably isn't the norm. We're not slaves working for survival, but we are living in a performance-based culture, aren't we? It's success-orientated, it is competitive, and it is exhausting. We also have these mini computers in our pockets. You can also call people on them, apparently. And they are constantly giving us information. And this is a technological marvel, but it's also a kind of technological compulsivity. I don't know if that is a word, but I'm going to use it. And does anyone else get anxious if you don't know where your phone is? How long can you go without checking your WhatsApps or your emails or your messages? You ever tried to time yourself? The Trappist monk Thomas Merton wrote this. He said, to allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone in everything, is to succumb to violence. violence. And I read that and I thought it was a bit strong. But then I read it again and I stopped and I thought about all the times that I have made myself ill because I've overpromised on what I've been able to do, and then I haven't given myself adequate time to recuperate. And I think if we're honest, I'm probably not the only one in the room who has done that. And biologically, it is a fact that stress affects physical health. In Japan, they have this thing called karoshi. And I'm going to tell you about karoshi. It is a medical condition, and it means death by overwork. They have a name for it because so many people have been affected by karoshi. Is that not the most depressing thing you've ever heard? And God, he steps into our lives and he gives us this gift of rest. And the problem for the Israelites was that they were so used to being slaves that they didn't know how to live as God's people. And can I have my first slide up, please? So with these 10 commandments, while they're in the desert, God is teaching them how to live as his people so that they are ready for the next step. They're ready for the promised land, which is where they're going. And the aim for them when they get there isn't just to live, but to flourish. Not as slaves, but as beloved children. Thank you, Sam. And we too, we need to learn God's ways. We too need this gift of rest. And I think we actually need to learn how to rest. And we live in a time where your identity is defined by what you do. And hyperactivity is the norm. Why else do we have the phrase, time is money? And we're so obsessed with doing that we're not very good at being. So we're exhausted. And we need desperately, I think, to take seriously this idea of Sabbath. But the gift of God's rest, it is able to resist exhaustion. It is the heavenly strategy to avoid burnout culture. The gift of rest is a blessing. And I want to say that rest is not relaxation. Rest is not relaxation. Rest is restoration. It's about moving from anxiety to peace, from control to total surrender. The gift of Sabbath, it is fundamentally about stopping from your work, but it is also fundamentally about God. Our passage says God rested on the seventh day. God blessed that day and made it holy. And I think what it's getting at is that taking a day off or a day out is an expression of faith. It's putting reliance back onto God and getting kind of refreshed in the process, which is actually an act of worship. And when I say worship, I don't mean when we sing, but the attitude of setting your heart and your mind back to God again, to acknowledge him as the creator and sustainer of all things, including you. In fact, taking a day to reset your rhythms and remember that you're a beloved child of God might just be the thing that sustains you. So we desperately need this gift of rest. Whether it's spiritual rest, emotional rest, physical rest, intellectual rest, even social rest for the party animals out there. And if you're going to do that, then you need to be super intentional about it. Rest is not relaxation. Rest is restoration. So binge watching Netflix or the Rings of Power might relax you, but it won't restore you. And one of my lecturers puts all of his and his family's digital devices into a box for the traditional Jewish Sabbath, which is a Friday night to the end of Saturday. So they don't do screens for Sabbath. And as a trainee vicar, I am here at Ascension 3 days a week, and 3 days a week I have a sort of another double life as a mature student, which also means I'm entitled to a young person's rail card, which is a big win. But it also means I have essays, I have lectures, I'm constantly reading all these books, And my day off is a Saturday. And having done this for a year now, I have learned to be unashamedly super, super picky about who I see and what I do on a Saturday. And I try not to do house jobs like laundry and grocery shopping because it's not restful. Like our Sabbath can't be the time where we're catching up on chores because actually that's still working. And I know a lot of us this morning have got small children, and the whole concept of rest probably just means uninterrupted sleep. And I want to say, bless you. And the washing machine is probably always on. But I want to challenge all of us to really take hold of this gift of rest and to take it seriously. If we are to receive restoration in a culture that tries to numb us with senseless pleasure, then we need to recover that rest. And we also need to recover the wonder of godly delight. Because biblical delight is all about feasting on the goodness of God, which brings me to my second point, the gift of joy. So Sabbath is a gift of rest, and Sabbath is also a gift of joy. So Sabbath is a gift of joy. I said at the beginning that Sabbath is the command we most undervalue or take for granted. And I think that's really weird, considering A, that it's a gift, and B, that it's something that God actually does himself and invites us to do it with him. So if we look at our Exodus passage again, it explains the logic of the Sabbath in verse 11. For 6 days, God made the heavens and the earth and the sea, casual, and all that is in them, but then he stopped on the seventh day and he rested. And to be a Christian is to be in Christ. In our Exodus passage, it makes it very, very clear that stopping and resting is part of who God is. And if we call ourselves a Christian this morning, if that's something God does, then the logic is it's something that we do. And God did not stop because he was tired. I'm going to say that again. God did not stop because he was tired, despite making the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. Because, spoiler alert, he's God. He doesn't get tired, so why does he stop? And John Mark Comer, who I would really recommend on the subject of Sabbath, has written a whole book about stopping. And he says this. He says the Hebrew word Shabbat means to stop, but it can also be translated to delight. It has this dual idea of stopping and also of joying in God and our lives in the world. The Sabbath day is an entire day set aside to follow God's example, to stop and to delight. So God did not stop because he was tired. He stopped to enjoy what he had made. And this good gift of God's rest invites us to join in with him in that delight. It invites us to this gift of joy. Sabbath keeping is not meant to be legalistic or wearisome. It's meant to be joyful. And when I was a child, I had this idea that God was like this man in the clouds with a beard, and he was out to punish me the moment that I stepped out of line. And when I came to faith, it was this huge revelation that A, God has a sense of humour, and B, he's also kind of fun. And in Sabbath, we get a glimpse of that, this invitation to share in God's joy. And in the Exodus story, we have the journey from slavery to the promised land. And in some ways, that journey is like a paradigm of the Christian story. We also are waiting, not for the promised land, but the promise of heaven, the new land, the new heaven and the new earth. And can I have my next slide? Thank you. And just as the Israelites gathered at Mount Sinai to learn how to live as God's people, so do we do that when we gather at church. There's a promised land for us as well. And in our second reading from Hebrews 3, in verse 13, it says to encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today. And the reason for that is to safeguard your faith in God's goodness so that you can enter the final Sabbath rest. In Hebrews 4, verse 1, it talks about the promise of entering his rest. And I want to say that Sabbath is a gift of joy. And part of that gift is by coming to church. Jewish rabbis viewed the main duties of the Sabbath to praise God and to enjoy food and drink in the home, which sounds an awful lot to me like Sunday worship and Sunday lunch. And we are called to stop, to worship, and to delight, to feast on God's goodness, and just to feast. And I know there are several people in this room who make a mean roast chicken. And the practice of worship and of celebration is meant to be like a little foretaste of heaven, the promise of entering his rest, as it says in this passage in Hebrews. And when we practice Sabbath, we get a taste of that heavenly feel. And that taste of heaven, it is meant to fuel you. Rest is not relaxation, but restoration. Sabbath cannot be just about collapsing with exhaustion, but stimulating desire for more of God, feasting on his goodness. And we need each other to do that. That's part of why we go to church. So well done, you are all here. Give yourselves a metaphorical pat on the back. Keep coming and keep getting fed. And our worship here, even those who, like myself, basically can't sing, is a foretaste of heavenly worship. And we need to fuel our anticipation of that. We need to stimulate our desire. We need each other. And we need joy, else life is pretty bleak. And in this passage in Hebrews 3:13, it says, keep on encouraging one another daily. And that happens when we gather to worship together. It happens in small groups. It happens when you meet up for coffee with someone from church, because we remind one another of who we are. And we keep one another from being hardened by sin's deceitfulness. And part of this practice of Sabbath and retreating for a day from the world and its pressures and temptations is resetting your life upon God. And it is deepening your desire for more of him. Sabbath is about restoration, not relaxation. So coming to church, it's not just treating God as a sort of object who's going to meet all of your needs, but it's inviting you to join in with him. And I love the words at communion that we're going to have in a bit. And it says that we are joining in with the eternal song of heaven. And that might seem a bit abstract and a bit conceptual, but this act of worship is like a foretaste of the celebration and feasting that we one day will get in heaven. Let it stimulate your desire for more of God. Sabbath is a day not just to collapse on, not just to catch up on sleep, but if you need sleep, please do also do that, but to feed your relationship with God and cause you to want him even more, to share in his joy. It is a gift of joy. But there's a challenge in this passage in Hebrews as well, isn't there? The tragedy is that the Israelites missed out on that. You know, reading this passage, it says, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion, when your fathers tested and tried me, and for 40 years saw what I did." And the Israelites in the desert spent 40 years literally going round in circles because they weren't able to let go of their slavery mentality, where they had to work for survival. They weren't ready for the promised land because in their heads they were still in Egypt. They couldn't believe and just trust, so they disbelieved by not following through on God's commandments. And in verse 19 it says they were not able to enter the promised land because of their unbelief. But, and here is the encouragement, in the next verse in Hebrews 4 verse 1, it says, despite all of that, the promise of entering his rest still stands. The invitation is still there. So the gift of rest and the gift of joy. The challenge to take Sabbath seriously. And that gift, it is a gift to be shared, which is my final point. And can I have my final slide, please, Sam? The paradigm of the Christian life is not just passively waiting for heaven, but actively engaging with God in the world and being a blessing to those around us. Now, I'm an introvert, so for me, Sabbath is a cycle of kind of withdraw, retreat, restore, and re-engage. But whoever we are, Sabbath is a gift to be shared. And the pattern is we come to church, we are renewed and restored and refreshed, and we are sent back out into the world again to freely share what we have been given. Thank you, Sam. And that might be inviting someone to lunch. That might be inviting people to somehow share in your practice of Sabbath. And I've been deliberately not trying to give people rules or guidelines on how to do that. It's something we all need to work out, but we need to take it seriously. And whoever we are able to share it, though. So maybe it is a physical invitation. Maybe it's witnessing a different way of life to our colleagues. And we live in a time where exhaustion is recognized, and self-care has become its whole wellness industry. You can spend a fortune on wellness, but I want to share with you a vision. What would it look like if the church was recognized as the place to get well? If you were broken and exhausted and hurting, and here was the place where you could receive life and healing and restoration. We live in a world of non-stop achievement, and God is calling us to lay down our tools and receive this good gift of rest, to delight with him in joy, to feast together. And those who take Sabbath seriously and resist exhaustion, not merely for self-care, but to retune their hearts to God's calling, are going to stand out. They will be the prophetic witnesses to the world that having it all is actually possessing nothing if you don't also have life. Those will be the people of faith who are in touch with their hearts so that they keep them soft and guard them from having hard hearts, as it said in our Hebrews passage, because they have the courage to live by faith. Those people might even be people like Moses, who give up worldly success to go back to their Egypt and speak up for those who don't have a voice, who stand up to oppression and injustice. And we are called to this sacred rhythm of rest and restoration, of creating time to stop and delight, and it should provoke questions about who we worship. Jesus said, "I come that they might have life, and life in all of its fullness." Sabbath, it is a gift to be shared. It is a gift of joy, and it is God's good gift of rest. Amen.